Misconception number 31. Unlicensed games can damage your console. There is a hint of truth to this, but really it's something that companies like Atari and Nintendo came up with to hurt the sales of unlicensed games. These days, you have to actually modify a system to allow unlicensed or homebrew games to be played. But back in the Atari games, they just released the games. Nintendo took steps to avoid this, as they felt that the glut of cheap product led to the crash, and they were right. So they put a lockout chip in their NES console, which would cause the console to reset constantly if you tried to play an unlicensed game in it. The unlicensed carts bypass this, usually by shocking the chip. So technically it was damaging a part of your console, but it would not damage your console in a way that prevented you from playing games. Technically, it would also void your warranty, but, well, I won't tell if you don't. Misconception number 32. Resident Evil started the survival horror genre. This one is popular, but untrue for a few reasons. While it's true that the term survival horror was first coined to describe Resident Evil, the fact is that Resident Evil was more of a modern take on classic adventure games. At its core, it's not all that different from King's Quest, just with a modern horror setting instead of a fantasy medieval setting. But survival horror games like Resident Evil already existed, such as Alone in the Dark on PC. Hell, Resident Evil itself is sort of a remake of a little-known NES title called Sweet Home, and Haunted House on the Atari 2600 definitely qualifies. Misconception number 33. Budget titles are shovelware. Shovelware is a colloquial term referring to cheap titles that are shoveled out en masse and are usually of poor quality. While you'll find a lot of shovelware titles in the bargain bins, not every bargain bin game is terrible shovelware. Keep in mind that the cost of games can be related to several different factors, including development costs. I talked about this with AAA titles previously. They're not always good, and sometimes indie games are good. Unfortunately, to compete with the big dogs, indie titles have to be cheaper, and wind up being budget titles. But this doesn't mean that they're shovelware, or even that they're bad. Misconception number 34. The Atari 2600 was the first console to use cartridges to play external games. Before the Atari, there were many Pong consoles that used snap-on cartridges. But for the sake of sanity, let's not even get into the Pong consoles. The Odyssey also used cartridges, sort of. They didn't have a plastic casing, but they were used to tell the system which scenarios to run. All of the games were already coded into the system, and all of the cartridges came with the system. The first cartridge system that had separately sold cartridges to play external games was the Channel F, made by Fairchild, possibly the most important console of all time. Later on, they followed it up with the Channel F Mark II, but this one was doomed to fail due to the superior Atari 2600 being released. Misconception number 35. Downloading games to your console is a relatively new thing. Once again, this is a lot older than you think. People who think of downloading full games is an experience that started with Xbox Live and PlayStation Network only need to talk to anybody who was a big Sega fan as a kid, as their Sega channel let people play games without buying a cartridge. But it actually goes back even further than that. The first system to be able to download games was the Intellivision. Always interesting to talk about the Intellivision. It used a system called Play Cable that let people who had the system and a cable TV subscription to download games. Their rival, Atari, followed up with a download service for the Atari 2600 called GameLine. GameLine was a huge flop, but it actually led to the creation of America Online, which popularized the internet in the 90s. Misconception number 36. Sega originated in Japan. Well, it's based in Japan and run by Japanese people, makes Japanese games, right? Well, actually, Sega, or as it was originally called, Service Games, was started by two Americans, Raymond Lamar and Richard Stewart, who started in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1940, and then later they moved it to Tokyo, Japan in 1951, where they mainly sold amusement games like slot machines and jukeboxes to American service personnel who were stationed in Japan. Service games grew and owned many arcades in Japan. They later merged with Rosen Enterprises, another American company operating in Japan, and the company became Sega Enterprises. In 1965, Sega was sold to another American company, Gulf and Western Industries, and in 1982 it was sold to Bally Manufacturing, another American company. It was around this time that David Rosen, who was the CEO of Sega, stepped down and was replaced by a Japanese person, Hayao Nakayama. The first time that Sega was owned by the Japanese was in 1984 when it was sold to CSK, which is oddly enough when Sega first started doing business in the United States. Eventually, the company merged with Sammy and became Sega Sammy Holdings. So, although Sega is based in Japan and is now owned by Japanese people, it was started by two Americans in Hawaii and remained in American hands for 44 years. Misconception number 37. The Sega Saturn was the first standalone CD-based console. This one's easy to believe, but once again, it's false. The first standalone CD-based game console was the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, which was released in 1993. The CDI was another example of a CD-based console that came out before the Saturn. Both of these were, of course, huge failures. Misconception number 38. The Konami code came from Contra. Up, up, down, down, left, right, BA. And then start, depending on the game. Everyone who grew up in the 80s knows the Konami code, which is often called the Contra code, which gave you 30 lives. However, it appeared first in the game Gradius, not Contra. The reason it's called the Contra code probably has something to do with Contra being difficult, and the code being almost mandatory for the majority of players to beat the game. Misconception number 39. The PlayStation 2 was the first console to have a hard drive. Nope. It was actually Sega's Saturn, a full generation before the PlayStation 2. Not only did the Saturn have a hard drive, but it wasn't sold separately and actually came with the console. Misconception number 40. Either Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest is the most successful series of RPGs ever. This one isn't even close. Dragon Quest is often cited as being the most popular franchise of RPGs in Japan, but has fared less well outside of Japan. It sold a total of 58 million copies to date. Final Fantasy is more widely accepted throughout the world and has sales of 102 million copies. But you probably forgot about Pokemon. Yeah, sometimes it's easy to forget that these are RPGs. And while there are plenty of Pokemon offshoots that aren't RPGs, the total sales figures of 215 million for the series leaves no wiggle room at all with this. Pokemon is the most successful RPG series of all time, and the second most successful series of all time, period, right after Mario.